Assessment for Learning, a Norwegian Story. This is a One School for All lecture by Andrew Thomas for my students to watch before the 25th of September, Monday the 25th. So we're going to look at the Norwegian story of assessment for learning. It's actually an international movement where we're going to concentrate on the Norwegian history. But before you can understand what's been going on, you need to know roughly what this revolution is, because it is a revolution in pedagogical thought. And it's essentially the idea that teachers need to know what their pupils are good and bad at in order to be able to pitch their lessons at the right level. There's no point going over something that they've already learned too much, and there's certainly no point in going forward and relying on the previous lesson if they haven't actually learned their previous lesson. So teachers need feedback from students, and students also need feedback from the teachers, because they need to know how good and bad their work is themselves, so that when they get their mark, for example, or when they start planning their strategy for the future, they don't think that they'd be perfectly satisfied with what they did badly at and carry on doing the mistakes that they did last time. But at the same time, they don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater if they actually did something well. So they need to be able to sort those two things through themselves. And that's basically assessment for learning in a nutshell. The history is got an international history, and it comes from this. I guess it's difficult to say a start mark, but a lot of people refer to the 1998 book, A Black Box. You should perhaps Google what a black box is. Essentially an image of behaviorism. The idea is that we know what goes into a pupil's head and we know what comes out of the pupil's head, but how do we know what produces what comes out of the pupil's head? And essentially the book that Black and Williams wrote was an idea of opening the black box and saying, what is it that generates these good and bad results in school teaching? What are the most powerful mechanisms that produce these results? And their conclusion was that it's assessment. It's a good and bad assessment. Bad assessment produces bad learning. Good assessment produces good learning. And they think that's the most powerful generative teaching technique in schools today. And then 10 years later, John Hattie wrote a book, which you may have heard of, called Visible Learning, which summarized 800 meta-analyses. A meta-analysis is a kind of summary of many research projects. And he summarized lots of those, so you can say that he's actually summarizing thousands and thousands of research projects altogether. And he came to a number of conclusions, but largely a lot of the assessment, the kind of assessment family of teaching techniques are one of the most powerful predictors of successful learning. So two empirical research projects that came out with a very similar idea, and basically the Norwegian government read these reports, or at least they read the first one, and they said we need to do something about assessment in Norwegian schools. And the first thing they did was to revamp the rules for assessment practice. Notice that I've written up the three arms of government here. It's the executive arm. It's the rules for or the regulations on the Education Act. It's not the Education Act itself, which is written by it's the responsibility of Parliament. It's the Ministry of Education's responsibility here, the regulations. And essentially they revamped Chapter 3 in the regulations for the Education Act, which is all about assessment. One of the major things they did already from 2010 was talk about and set in stone that pupils have a right to formative assessment throughout the year, at least once per semester. And there are various developments in the period that we're talking about. It started about 2007. That was when the research project started. 2010 was the major revamping, and then 2015 they put in stone the right that a pupil has to assess their own learning. So that was the first major thing. That's the assessment regulations were rehashed. And the second thing was, from 2007 right until present day, there have been development projects in the grassroots level in schools all over the country, where teachers have to learn better assessment techniques. And it's done in different ways, and it's been done in different ways throughout the years. But essentially, it boils down to teachers relearning some of the things that they learned when they did their original teacher training. So teachers are basically going back to the school bench and learning what is good and bad assessment practice alongside their work, because all schools are basically trying to be better schools. And these projects, both the assessment for learning legal project, as in the revamping of the regulations, but also the development projects, these are all along the lines of four main principles, which are that the first one is that pupils and apprentices must understand what they are learning and what is expected of them. It's no longer the case that teachers keep the assessment to themselves, and pupils take a test, and then the teacher has this kind of gotcha effect at the end. You did that right and that wrong. You didn't know that I was going to ask you to do that. It's always such that pupils and apprentices must have access to the criteria. You can't apply a criterion whilst you are marking a paper without also telling the pupil about it first. It's actually illegal in Norway to do that. Secondly, pupils and apprentices must get feedback that tells them about the quality of their work. This does not mean that they get a grade. This doesn't mean that they're marked and placed somewhere between A and F. This actually says what is good about their work and what is bad about their work. In actual fact, Norwegians don't get grades on their work until they're about the age of 14, which is to say until they get to the 8th year. But they do need to know about the quality of what they're doing. It's not a social thing of I think you're a very good person. It's always a quality of the work, not the person that's in focus. Okay, the third principle is that pupils and apprentices must get advice on improvement. It's never just you are a C. It's you got a C. Your mark was a C here. In order to make it into a B, you have to do the following. Yeah. So it's also the advice takes you upwards in the character in the grade scale. And fourthly, pupils and apprentices must be involved in their own learning, including by assessing their own work and development. The idea is that if you can assess your own work, then you can talk about the strengths and weaknesses of your work, and that means you can correct them whilst you're already in the test, and not just looking back on it afterwards. Whilst you're doing the test, you can say, "Oh, I can see I'm doing that mistake that I always do. I must change it straight away." So these four principles they run through all the development work, and you can. This is my translation. I haven't found an official translation of the four principles yet. So essentially, there is a research base, and that's an international view. The Black and Williams and the Hattie research they set the tone for the project. But then it was a legal overhaul of the regulations of the Education Act, and it was a development project, and it's an ongoing project. And the four principles that we talked about, they do actually summarise most of the work in assessment along the lines of the assessment for learning school of educational thought. Notice, if you want to change a practice, it seems like you have to actually change the law in Norway, and this means that it becomes a right. Pupils have to have a right to have teachers that do these things and that value these things, which also means that teachers actually have to document when they do things, and that is the way of human rights of any kind, that they have to be documented so that somebody can actually check it. And one of the results of the Assessment for Learning project is that teachers have, in many schools, been drowning in documentation because they have to prove that they have been doing the right things. Make a regulation and then monitor the school workers. It's the Norwegian way of education.